The factions are one of the most iconic presences within Sigil, to the point that to many they may as well be synonymous. But when did these organizations start, and how? The fact that belief is power upon the planes is well known, so the very idea that there was a start to them is strange to consider. And yet there must have been a moment when this idea became the organized system it is today. The earliest known record of the factions is the story of the 12 Factals, a minor bar within the Ladies' Ward of Sigil. Its servers and regulars often share the tale of when the expansionist factions threatened to take over the entire city around 1,000 years ago, and 12 unnamed Factals appealed to the lady herself at the future site of the bar. While its leader, Vartus Timlin, certainly was mazed around this time, and the expansionists did dissolve very shortly after, these details seem likely to be merely folklore. Not only because the factions were a disorganized mess at this point, the term factal not even yet in use, but because the factions were not a significant power in the city until some 500 years ago. In the start of the governor's recorded history of Sigil, 982 years before the start of Planescape, it was the guilds who held power, just as in many other major cities on the plains and in the Prime. And for similar reasons. Sigil, as the greatest hub for trade and travel one could imagine in the multiverse, has always been a significant economic power. It connects to all planes in mostly reliable fashions, its neutrality means none are favored over others, and its protection by the Lady means it is safe from the most disruptive invasions. And so, as always, the guild's control of trade naturally meant political control over Sigil as well. But the organizations that would lead to the factions still existed. The governors were the first to be mentioned in the records, obviously, but the Dustmen already had a long and storied presence. And these two were followed over the next 4 centuries by many names still known today. The Aethar, the Believers of the Source, the Transcendent Order, the Fated. These organizations proliferated, with over 50 such organizations recorded at their peak, all squabbling amongst themselves and taking on the name faction to reflect that each of them disagreed with the beliefs of all the others. And the fervency of this disagreement only grew over time, shifting from words amongst each other to shouting matches in the public squares to acts of violence. Eventually, the entire city was embroiled, leaving it unsafe to even walk the streets. And, as with anything that threatened Sigil, the Lady finally intervened in an event some 630 years ago that came to be known as the Great Upheaval. In a single day, she appeared in person before each of the then 49 Factals, with a Dabus at her side, silently pointing to the Dabus with a sharp finger as it shared to each the same message. By the orders of the Lady of Pain, there will be but 15 factions in Sigil. Organize thy colors by a fortnight hence, or die. At first, the violence accelerated as each scrambled to be one of the last 15 standing. Some left the city, abandoning the title of faction and becoming one of the various planar sects known today, even the Aethar for a time relocating to the base of the spire. Some transformed, such as the merger of the Sons of Mercy and the Sod Killers into the faction known today as the Mercy Killers. Some new factions even coalesced in the chaos, such as the Doomguard and the Society of Sensation. And, as it always has in times of great unrest, the Free League grew from those wanting to avoid the entire mess, reaching their peak recorded membership of nearly 1 million, before being culled over the next few decades by an unknown plague to mere thousands. More will be spoken of on that in a future time, but remember it for now. In the end, though, the Lady's edict was obeyed with fewer than 18,000 deaths, and the number of factions in Sigil has been restricted to 15 ever since. Not the same 15, of course. The Harmonium and the Sensates didn't even exist at the time, after all, but as all are unsure if the edict was one-time or permanent, the number has been held at 15 by unwritten agreement, with new factions allowed to charter themselves only when old ones leave or dissolve. And as an unforeseen side effect, removing the rampant chaos between them meant the factions were able to properly organize for the first time. In the decades to follow, they were able to gain greater grip on their membership, banning the once common practice of namers gaining membership in multiple factions at once for the benefits thereof. And in the course of this, banning shared membership in any other sort of officially organized group as well, including the guilds. It was this single act that led to the decline and collapse of Sigil's guild system. Oh, some few trade guilds still do exist, but with hardly any power within the city. Even the vaunted Planewalkers Guild, the oldest continuous organization devoted to planar exploration and the very origin of the term Planewalker itself, abandoned Sigil in response. And in the vacuum in power left by the collapse of the guilds, the factions stepped in, taking control of the various civic duties the lady had always disinterestedly left to Sigilians to manage themselves. Now that the factions held proper power in the city, the Kriegstands, the Cold War between the factions, had begun in earnest, planning and politicking against one another to vie for more power in Sigil and in the plains itself, seeking not just to stand for a belief, but to spread that belief, to reshape understanding of the very plains itself, and take power through that act. Their power and presence began to spread even beyond the city, to the point that even some divine proxies claim membership today, even if their involvement in practice is dubious at best. In the centuries that followed, it became true that in the eyes of the many, the factions were Sigil. The Hardheads, pardon, the Harmonium, is one of those factions who simply cannot keep themselves from butting into the business of everyone else, certain in their conviction that theirs is the best and only way forward. As their name suggests, the Harmonium believes in harmony. Once every creature across the plains can live in peace without butting heads over the small stuff, their work will be done, and a new golden era will begin. And how should one achieve this? Well, the Harmonium knows exactly what kind of world they want, and the rest will conform. Of course, not everyone is comfortable with this idea of peace, but the Hardheads are not fools. They know that to have peace, you must make war, and they are more than ready to fight for their ideas if that will ensure an era of peace and prosperity. The ends justify the means, in a sense, but the Harmonium respect laws in all regards, including their own. The Harmonium serves as the guard and police force, as it were, of Sigil. They ensure that any Burg who breaks the laws and causes disorder within the city perimeters is put before a judge of the governors, and then punished appropriately by the Mercy Killers. And speaking of the Mercy Killers, these sods are some of the most feared in all of Sigil, for they are the ultimate believers in justice. That's justice with a capital J, by the way, because to the Red Death nothing is as sacred as ensuring that the scales are even. The law exists for a reason, and any who try to weasel out of its commandments deserve nothing but contempt. The Mercy Killers kill their own mercy, which they see as the true enemy to justice. Good or not, those of a weak heart will allow themselves to be manipulated by criminals into forgiving them, which will only bring more disorder to the plains. Indeed, merciful creatures might even need to have that mercy beaten out of them, and the Red Death sees no problem in sometimes overstepping their authority if it ensures that justice prevails in the long run. A body who thinks they are a cut above the rest in the brainbox department might call them out on this, but the Mercy Killers know with an absolute certainty that they, as justice's ultimate representatives, answer to a higher call, and that anything they do in its name is defensible. Ends justifying the means, my word. Quite on the opposite end of the spectrum is the Revolutionary League. Where the Mercy Killers and Harmonium seek to preserve the standing order, the anarchists wish to tear it down. They reject the current system of factals and politics, holding firebrand speeches of the importance of helping the oppressed. They don't care about the truth of the multiverse, at least not yet, for while the common folk allow themselves to be dominated by the plutocrats, no one will even be able to perceive it. Some might argue that the Revolutionary League are self-serving as well, But they do work hard to dispel such a myth. They have no permanent headquarters, no facthole, and they do not allow their members to hold positions of power or influence within the city. Any wealth must be distributed, either to the cause or to the poor and needy, and they will not rest until Sigil has become a society where all are equal, even if some heads must roll for that to become a truth. The Sign of One. Where to begin? The signers are unlike any other cutters you'll ever meet, and I mean that in the kindest way possible. I feel bad for them because they've deluded themselves into thinking that the multiverse only exists because some Burke out there is imagining it all. They think that they, singular they, are the center of all existence, and should they cease to be, well then, so might everything else. It's all just a grand illusion, you see, a figment, a dream, a whimsy. Who's the one creating it all? No idea, so to be on the safe side, we'll just assume it could be anyone. Of the signers, of course. Obviously, not all of them are quite so far with their heads up their asses, but dealing with this group is a nightmare. They are an egocentric bunch and believe that reality will bend to any will strong enough to reimagine it, and they are masters of convincing themselves that they are the masters of their own fate. Imagine, they will tell you with a smarmy look on their face, that soon you will come upon a large amount of money. In less than a week, I promise you will have it, if you imagine it hard enough, of course. Pfft, hogwash, all of it. But then there's always a gullible clueless who will buy into it and keep perpetuating this nonsense idea of self-actualization through cheap fantasies. The Society of Sensation are perhaps even more frustrating to deal with, because while they might not be convinced the multiverse revolves around them, they're far more certain that the multiverse must be experienced, not through books or words or even sight, but through all senses imaginable. Only by touching, smelling, licking something can you experience what the multiverse has to offer you. The Sensates are hedonists, plain and simple, and they will never pass up an opportunity to indulge themselves in pleasure. Some of them will go even farther and argue that all sensations, pleasurable or painful, need to be experienced. And those I hold a smidge more respect for, because they at least are willing to make sacrifices to learn the dark they seek. The society tends to travel far and wide in search of new and interesting experiences, and they often record these as well in so-called sensory stones, which capture all the physical impressions of an experience for later. Members of the Sensates are allowed access to these stones in the civic fest halls, their headquarters, and some members never leave, having all the necessities and luxuries they could ever need, and the full plethora of sensations from all over the planes at the tip of their fingers. The Transcendent Order believes in intuition above all else. Only when the mind and body act in complete unison can one achieve the unity with the multiverse required to perceive the dark of it. Any Burke who stops to think about what to do, to weigh the pros and cons, has already lost, they say. The body knows what it needs to do, whether that be to fight, flee, or otherwise, but most of us are so caught up in our small matters that we trip over ourselves whenever we try to do anything more complicated than tying our own shoelaces. Of course, that doesn't mean you should just turn off your brain and do whatever thing your body feels like doing. Only by achieving that aforementioned perfect balance between mind and body can you know how to act, how to think, and how to move. The right action will come automatically, and you will go through life untroubled by doubts or second guesses. Suffice to say, this group has a lukewarm relationship with most other factions. Many of their members are not necessarily bad people, but they tend to be rather unpredictable and difficult to work with, especially on longer projects. And some might join the ciphers and then decide they're going to blow up the Hall of Records because they got the impulse to do so. Not too far from my own faction's teachings, the Chaositects, or Chaos Men, as they're commonly called, don't believe in any kind of purpose or reason of the multiverse. To them, it's all just chaos. The fact that we've got bodies and brains today doesn't necessarily mean that they will be there tomorrow, and today's allies may certainly be tomorrow's enemies. simply because it would be unreasonable for such a change to occur. The group is one of the less popular ones of Sigil, as both the Harmonium and governors dislike them strongly, and those generally tend to not have much trouble bringing the Mercy Killers along in hunting them as well. It is hard to know who's a member of the Chaosmen though, because they could be literally anyone, and sometimes anything, and only by observing them over a period of time can one discern the pattern of randomness to their behavior that might belie their allegiance. What differs the Chaosmen from the Bleakers, I should point out, is that the Bleak Cabal understands that there is no purpose, but does not for that matter entirely give up the idea of finding their own purpose, that is. They will help the poor and destitute, care for the mentally ill, and so on, but the Chaosmen despise long-term planning and have very little in terms of order or structure to rely on. And those are the factions of Sigil. There have been others, there will be others, but at the time of writing these 15 remain the most common powers any cutters to encounter in Sigil, barring the Lady of Pain, and nobody wants to get involved with her if they can avoid it. In the future I will teach you more about them, but for now the purpose of these lectures has been fulfilled. You know enough now not to make a fool of yourself out there on the streets of the City of Doors, and that will suffice for now. The three grandchildren of Cain wait patiently for the time of judgment to arise. Bambi Parsons, a leader with an unbreakable will, Procyon, who has been reborn as a god amongst Cain's angels, and Dugal, whose thirst for blood is matched only by his strength of will and purpose. Their children, the Methuselah, control our every move through their timeless jihad. They are Her Satanic Majesty Dani, whose presence chills the blood, Socrates Johnson, a masterful craftsman of stories, Lauren Eason, a trustworthy ally and friend, and Alexander Kishtaria, esoteric scholar and mentor in magecraft. On the Council of the Primogen are seated Edward Reed, Ian Nichols, Raven Fang, and the Autumn Alchemist, wise leaders and of good judgment. This week the Council would wish to thank the Elder Lily of the North Star for your continued insight into matters of our common interest and for your friendship. We would also wish to give our regards to the Ancile Victor Quirot, whose service to the Council has not gone unnoticed. Thank you for your support. Naturally, all our elders, Ancile, and neonates receive our gratitude from the bottoms of our hearts. Without your support, this would not be possible. And thank you for watching. May the Lady of Blades never cross your path, Cutter. Until next time.